Welcome to How to Gain Admission to Stanford and Ivy League Universities. I'm Dan Lee, and I am one of the co-founders and a senior admissions consultant at Solomon Admissions Consulting. So at Solomon Admissions Consulting, all of our consultants are former admissions officers at Ivy League as well as other top 20 universities. So these include people such as the Associate Director of Admissions at Cornell, the former Senior Associate Director of Admissions at the University of Pennsylvania, the former Assistant Director of Admissions at MIT and Dartmouth, etc., as well as other top schools. So the first question to ask is why care? Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford reject over 60% of applicants who are both valedictorians and who have a perfect 1600 on the SAT. Stanford in particular rejects over 70% of students with a perfect SAT score. So here are the 2017-2018 average acceptance rates. So in the first column, you'll see the average acceptance rates at top universities over a decade ago in 2005. In the second column, you'll see the average acceptance rates at those universities last year. And in the third column, you will see the acceptance rates of students who worked with Solomon Admissions Consulting. So for example, in 2005, over a decade ago, the acceptance rate at Columbia University in New York City was 12%. This past year, in 2017, the acceptance rate at Columbia University was less than half of that, so it was 5.5%. And this past year, 35.3% of our students who applied to Columbia University got into Columbia University. Another example is Stanford. The average acceptance rate at Stanford in 2005 was 13%. The acceptance rate at Stanford last year was 4.3%. And this past year, 16.7% of our students who applied to Stanford got into Stanford. So you can see that the acceptance rates at the top schools have collapsed by over 50% in the last decade to 12 years. And you can also see the success of our students who apply to those schools using some of the strategies that we'll outline in this presentation. So let's take a look at how elite colleges evaluate applicants. So every college evaluates applicants based on a combination of their academic as well as their personal profile components. So at most top schools, the SAT scores slash ACT score, as well as your SAT2 scores, count for about 25% of the overall evaluation process. And keep in mind, a lot of students we work with don't realize the importance of SAT2s. They are actually more important than your AP scores if you're applying to Ivy League and other Ivy Plus institutions. Your grades, your class rank, and your course difficulty or course rigor, which means the number of AP courses that you've taken, factors in for another 25%. And then the last 50% is actually improvable at the time that you apply. So 25%, which is improvable at the time that you apply, is your personal statement, your supplemental essays, which are tailored to what every school looks for. So if you're applying to Stanford, they look for intellectual vitality. If you apply to UPenn, they look for students who take an interdisciplinary approach to academics. You have to emphasize these key components of what every school is looking for in terms of fit in your personal statement for that particular school. And then the last part of that is the addendum, and the addendum is the additional information section of the common application. That's a section that you use to explain away anomalies in your academic background, such as having a semester where you got a lot of Bs. You have to explain that away. And the last 25% is your activity sheet, which we can help you put together, your interviews, as well as your recommendation letters. And we can also advise you on all of those things, which are improvable at the time of your application. So how does Stanford evaluate applicants? So the first thing to know is that Stanford actually recalculates your GPA when you apply. And so the way they recalculate your GPA is that they look at your grades from 10th and 11th grade only. So if you had a poor freshman year in high school, but you did great in 10th and 11th grade, then that's going to be positive at a place like Stanford, since they don't look at your freshman grades. Stanford also uses academic courses only. So by academic core courses, I'm talking about foreign language, science, math, history, English. So no no PE classes, typing, band, or orchestra. So if you did poorly in PE, typing, band, or orchestra, those grades are thrown out when they recalculate your grades. And Stanford also uses what they call flat grading to recalculate your GPA. So what that means is that if you have an A- on your transcript in an academic core course, that becomes an A. And so that's great if you got an A-. On the other hand, if you got a B+, that actually gets downgraded to a B. And so it's not as positive if you have a lot of B+ on your transcript. Let's talk about the Stanford applicant rating system. So Stanford assigns every applicant 3 ratings on a separate 1 to 6 scale, 1 being the highest and 6 being the lowest. So Stanford gives everyone an academic rating on a 1 to 6 scale, 1 being the highest, 6 being the lowest, and that's based on a combination of your grades, your course rigor, your class rank, as well as your standardized test scores on your SATs, ACTs, and your SAT-2s. They also give you an extracurricular rating on a 1 to 6 scale, 1 being the highest, 6 being the lowest. And Stanford, like all top schools, is looking for students who have a very angular extracurricular profile, and they're not looking for well-rounded students. So students who score highly on the extracurricular rating, which would be a 1 or a 2, would be students who are extremely angular, who have national awards at one thing. And the third rating that's unique to Stanford that they give you is what's called an intellectual vitality rating. It's on a 1 to 6 scale, 1 being the highest. And this rating has nothing to do with your test scores or your grades, but everything to do with whether you love learning outside the classroom or not. And it's often measured by whether you've done research with a professor or independent academic projects. Like I said, students who have the highest intellectual vitality rating are students who've generally done research with a professor in high school, who have been published or who won national awards. So let's look at what an intellectual vitality rating of 1 out of 6 would look like. And like I said, 1 is the highest rating. So this would be a student who's done independent academic research outside the classroom with a college professor in high school, leading to published research in a journal, hopefully. This student would have written a very strong Stanford intellectual vitality supplemental essay. The Stanford asks you a series of 3 main supplemental essays. 1 is the intellectual vitality essay, 1 is the note to your roommate, and the third one is an essay about what you're passionate about. And the intellectual vitality essay is the most important essay at Stanford that you will write. And Stanford is really looking for students who show a true love of learning for the sake of learning at a high level outside of the classroom. So when assessing intellectual vitality, Stanford is really asking a couple things. Number one, they're asking, does the applicant take ownership of his or her education outside the classroom? Is the applicant the kind of student who would enrich the learning of other Stanford students? And is the applicant passionate about learning? So let's take a look at the all-important intellectual vitality essay at Stanford. So the prompt is, the Stanford community is deeply curious and driven to learn in and outside of the classroom. Reflect on an idea or experience that makes you genuinely excited about learning. So this is what I call the never-ending dinner conversation essay. The ideal answer to this essay is an answer where you're talking about an intellectual topic that you could go on endlessly about during a dinner conversation. And Stanford is looking to weed out perfect students who are not intellectuals, who get perfect grades and test scores for the sake of getting into Stanford and getting a high-paying job, not because they actually love learning. So one thing to note is that it's very common for students with perfect grades and perfect test scores to have a very low intellectual vitality rating because they don't actually like learning. For them, learning is a means to an end. And this essay is testing whether you love learning for the sake of learning or for the sake of getting into Stanford. And obviously, they want the former, not the latter. A bad answer to this question is one that talks about Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States, which applicants often use to study for the AP US history exam. So Stanford is not looking for students who study for the sake of getting high grades and test scores. Even though you need those elements, they're looking for students who take it to the next level and who have a real curiosity for learning. And a great answer to the Stanford intellectual vitality question is one that addresses one intellectual idea which reveals your love of learning far beyond the classroom walls for the sake of learning. One idea that can be translated to undergraduate research and academic publication at Stanford and is hopefully related to your academic major or future career goals. Let's talk about some of the differences between Stanford and the Ivies. So unlike the Ivies, Stanford tends to admit the most compelling applicant, not necessarily the most qualified applicant on paper. And a lot of that has to do with the importance they put on the supplemental essays. Stanford tends to weigh the SATs and standardized testing slightly less than the Ivies. And on the flip side, they weigh grades very, very heavily. Stanford also weighs the supplemental essays more heavily than the Ivies. Stanford also weighs athletic recruiting more heavily than the Ivies. And the reason for this is Stanford has a much larger percentage of recruited athletes than most Ivy League institutions. In fact, if you look up Stanford athletes at the Olympics, if Stanford were a country, I believe they would be ranked 6 or 7 in terms of the number of gold medals versus other countries in the world. So there's a strong emphasis on athletic recruiting. Stanford also assigns applicants a separate intellectual vitality rating, and that's a rating that we've already gone over. Stanford does not give as big a boost to early action applicants as some of the Ivies, and the reason for that is they use early action predominantly to admit legacies, development cases, and recruited athletes, as well as the children or faculty. And so even though the early action acceptance rate at Stanford most years is between 9 to 10%, and the regular decision acceptance rate tends to be around 3%, it's kind of misleading because the majority of students who benefit from early action are what we call hooked applicants. They're applicants who are either legacies, development cases, or recruited athletes. And Stanford also tends to favor public school applicants over private school applicants. So how do Ivy League schools evaluate applicants? Let's look at the Ivy League applicant rating system. So Ivy League schools generally assign every applicant 2 separate ratings on varying scales, but it's often on a 1 to 9 scale. So what they'll do is they'll often assign applicants 2 ratings, an academic rating on a 1 to 9 scale, 9 being the highest, as well as a personal rating on a 1 to 9 scale, 9 being the highest. So let's take a look at what the academic rating, the highest academic rating, which is 9 out of 9 at the Ivies, would look like. So this would be a student who is in the top 1 to 2% of his or her high school class. This student would have taken the most challenging course load of AP courses. This student would have SAT, ACT, and SAT2 scores in the 99th percentile. This student would have glowing letters of recommendation indicating that the student is the best out of the applicants from the past several years from his or her high school. This student would show an intense level of learning as evidenced by academic research outside the classroom with a college professor, hopefully leading to publication in a journal. And this student would have the potential to be a leader in their academic field in the future. Let's take a look at what an academic rating of 7 out of 9 at the Ivies would be. And a lot of students who are 7 out of 9s at the Ivies end up getting rejected because 7 is considered a not great rating on the academic scale at the Ivies. So this is a student who's in the top 5% of his or her high school class. The student has taken the most challenging course load of AP courses. This student would have SAT, ACT, and SAT2 scores above the 95th percentile. This student would have a strong but unexceptional letters of recommendation. And this student generally lacks the intense love of learning of academic 9s with some independent reading outside the classroom, but no published research with a college professor. And oftentimes the student is driven to achieve by competition more so than by true love of learning. And so the Ivies give you an academic rating, and what they do is they actually incorporate Stanford's intellectual vitality rating into their academic rating. So if you are, for example, at Dartmouth, if you are a student with a perfect 4.0 unweighted GPA, as well as a perfect 1600 on the SAT, and you have no academic independent projects outside of that, well, then you would not be an academic 9 out of 9. You would be rated much lower because your intellectual vitality rating would drop you from a 9 to like a 7. Let's look at the Ivy League personal rating. So these are separate examples of students who would have a personal rating of 9 out of 9, which is the highest rating at the Ivies. And so the Ivies, like Stanford, like all top schools, look for extremely angular students. And so these schools are looking to build a well-rounded incoming class composed of students who are not well-rounded, but who are extremely angular. And so these are different examples of angularity. So a student who's a published author, a student who's an Intel STS finalist, which is the top 40 in the country, a student who's an Olympic medalist, a student who's soloed at Carnegie Hall, a student who's qualified for the US Math Olympiad or the JMO, a student who has awards at the national level and is extremely angular in that area that they have awards in, and a student who has a patent or who has a patent pending, obviously without parental involvement. Let's look at what a personal rating of 7 out of 9 would be, which is good but not exceptional at the Ivies. So this is a student who is less angular and who would have awards at the regional level and not at the national level. This student would still have a significant commitment at a high level to a few activities. Examples include student body president, all-state orchestra or band, captain of a varsity sports team, or nationally ranked debater. This student is well-rounded and involved, but not the most passionate about any one thing. And so this is what we call the jack of all trades, the master of none. These students have a very hard time getting into the Ivies. Let's look at the separate engineering admissions process at certain Ivy League schools. So at schools like Cornell, Columbia, and UPenn, there's a separate engineering admissions process, and that means there are different factors that come into play. So the first factor is that the engineering faculty are on the admissions committee, and so you are presenting your application to a very, very qualified audience in terms of them being engineering professors. And because they're engineering professors, there's a greater emphasis on grades and test scores. And so they're less forgiving of lower grades and lower test scores, where there's a separate admissions process for engineering. There's also a greater emphasis on academic research in engineering. And the last thing to note is that if you're a female applicant to engineering, basically all the top Ivies want a 50-50 male-female ratio. And so you are, in many cases, 1.5 to 2 times as likely to get in as an equally qualified male applicant of the same ethnicity. Should I apply early decision or early action by the November 1st deadline? Before I go on, the answer is a resounding yes, but I'll go into why. So most Ivy League and other top universities fill approximately 50% of their available seats in their incoming freshman class through early decision or early action, and the deadline for that is November 1st. So the advantage conferred by applying early decision or early action is the academic equivalent of adding 150 points to your SAT score, and they also lower the bar for you extracurricularly as well. So it's not just academics, they also lower the bar extracurricularly because you're, especially for early decision, because you're committing to going to that school, they're going to lower the bar slightly for you. Early decision and early action applicants at schools not named Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and Princeton compete against a weaker applicant pool. So what do I mean by that? It's a sliding scale. So if you take a school like Harvard, the strongest applicants in the country apply early action to Harvard. And so because of that, the early action pool at Harvard is going to be stronger than the regular decision pool. On the other hand, you take a school like Duke, the early decision pool at Duke is significantly weaker than the regular decision pool because you're not competing directly against the kids who are applying early to Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, or places like Columbia and UPenn, you know? And so because of that, certain schools have a much weaker early pool, which can work to your advantage. If you apply early, your application is read much more closely since there's more time to read, a fewer number of applications. And borderline applicants who are waitlisted to regular decision would have gotten in most likely had they applied early decision or early action in many cases. And so early decision is a great idea. At the same time, applying early decision or early action should be a calculated risk that you take, and we can advise you on exactly what schools you'd be competitive at for ED or EA and what schools are a complete waste of your time. So this next chart shows the, in the first column, you have the early decision or early action acceptance rate at Ivy League schools this past year. The second column has the regular decision acceptance rate. And the third column has the percent of the incoming freshman class that that particular school filled through either ED or EA. So let's take a school like Brown. So the early decision acceptance rate at Brown was 21.1%. The regular decision acceptance rate was almost 1/4 of that at 5.7%, so significantly lower. And Brown filled 38% of their freshman class through early decision. Let's look at another example. So at Harvard, the early action acceptance rate was 14.5%. The regular decision acceptance rate was 2.8%. But keep in mind that can be misleading because, like I said, the early pool at Harvard is much stronger than the regular decision pool. Let's talk about strategic positioning and crafting one's narrative. So what is strategic positioning? Strategic positioning is a fancy terminology for simply how to make your application stand out. So what you're doing is you're positioning your strengths against an institution's weaknesses. So if any of you are watching the US Open, the tennis analogy would be when Nadal plays Federer, often what Nadal will do is since he's left-handed, he'll take shots from his lefty forehand and he'll send it to Federer's weaker one-handed backhand. And he'll structure points such that most shots go from his forehand to Federer's backhand, and he'll break Federer's backhand down and win a lot of points that way. So he's pitting strength against weakness. And in the admissions consulting sense, it's the idea of doing the same thing in order to make you stand out. So an example of strategic positioning would be that it's actually more advantageous for a student who's an engineering whiz with science awards to market his or her strong engineering background to Yale, where not as many strong engineering majors apply, versus marketing it to MIT, where he would just be another face in the crowd. He's a dime a dozen. And so Yale in particular is very advantageous to apply early action to if you're a strong STEM applicant, because in the last 10 years, they've instituted what's called the STEM initiative, where they are trying to attract strong STEM students away from, where they're trying to attract strong STEM students away from Princeton, Stanford, and MIT. Let's talk about strategic positioning and building a class. So admissions committees are building a well-rounded incoming class composed of students who are not well-rounded, and these students are specialists, so they're the best at one thing. So the key question to ask is, who are you going to be in the incoming class at these elite colleges? What talent or perspective do you bring to the incoming class that no one else brings? And do you have the potential to be a future leader in your chosen field? So let's do a very simplistic example. So a lot of applicants who come to us are well-rounded students with great numbers, and these students generally never get into the Ivies or Stanford. Admissions committees at the top schools don't like admitting well-rounded students into their incoming class. They're looking for students who are passionate about one thing. That's really what they're looking for. So the strategy for a well-rounded applicant would be to center the personal statement on a singular passion or intellectual pursuit that makes the applicant seem more focused, because you can take a well-rounded student, and if you present them in a way that's angular, they can seem very angular and not well-rounded. So it has a lot to do with marketing and how you present yourself. Let's look at some common case studies of past students that Solomon Admissions Consulting has worked with. Case study number one is the undeclared major applicant. So this particular student that we worked with was a white male applicant from a public high school. He had a 3.7 GPA, which is weighted, taking a very light course load. He only had one AP course his first 3 years of high school, which generally is unacceptable at the top schools. He had a 33 on the ACT. He was an avid thespian, so he did a couple of plays at the local level, nothing national. And he really had no extracurricular activities outside of theater, and he was completely undecided on a major. And at the top schools, saying I don't know what I want to study is not an acceptable answer, because that's not a compelling answer. They're looking for people who are compelling. And so the strategic positioning that we used for this student was we helped this student discover his interest in linguistics through theater. And there's a lot of overlap between linguistics and theater because both deal with language. And so linguistics is an undersubscribed major at all schools. And so what we did with the student is we assisted this student in finding research with a linguistics professor over the summer. And this student ended up doing research in linguistics and actually was published as a 3rd or 4th author on a paper that summer. And we also suggested that the student found a nonprofit to show leadership initiative. He also did that. We had him submit a theater supplement as part of his application. And the outcome was that he was accepted at the University of Chicago, Georgetown, and NYU. And generally speaking, the University of Chicago does not accept students like this had he not done all that extra stuff along with the positioning that we recommended. Let's talk about case study number 2. This is the recruited athlete. So this particular applicant we worked with was a white female applicant from a private high school. She had a 3.6 weighted GPA. She had a tremendous number of B's on her transcript. She had a 2080 out of 2400 on the SAT, on the old SAT scale, which includes the writing section. She was a very talented track runner and recruited by several Division I schools. She was well-rounded extracurricularly and had no idea what she wanted to study. So once again, no idea is not an acceptable answer. So our strategic positioning for the student was that the student wanted to write about sports in the application, which is a big no-no for recruited athletes. If you're a recruited athlete, you want to write about everything except sports in your application because they already know you're good at sports. Don't tell them the obvious, you know? So we advised against writing about sports and had the student instead write her entire application about her leadership pursuits, and as well as her interest in mathematics and physics to showcase what she would bring to the campus outside of sports. And obviously, white female applicants are underrepresented in mathematics and physics. That's another reason we did that. So we positioned her as a physics major since women in general are underrepresented in physics. And the outcome is that she was accepted at her #1 choice, which was the College of William and Mary. Let's talk about a student with no extracurricular activities. So generally speaking, if you're a straight A student with great test scores and you have no extracurricular activities, you're not getting into a single top 20 school, you know? And so this is the challenge of an applicant that we worked with. She was a white female applicant from a public high school. She had a 3.9 GPA, but took very few AP courses. She only had a 30 on the ACT. And she basically spent her summers vacationing in Europe and visiting museums and shows in Paris and London. Really had no extracurricular activities and it was completely undecided on her major. And once again, that's not an acceptable answer to say, I don't know what I want to study in the application. So the way we strategically position our application is we use the student's interest in art through visiting famous art galleries around the world to position the student as an art history major. And the reason for that is art history is a very undersubscribed major and she had a real interest in it. So she would come across as authentic in the application. So the application talked about different pieces of art she had seen around the world and how they would translate to her major in art history. And the outcome was that this student was accepted at USC and at NYU. Let's talk about major specific case studies. And so these are case studies related to some of the most common majors that our students generally are interested in applying to. So case study #1 is the pre-med applicant. So there are many students we work with who want to be doctors. They're not allowed to talk about it in their application because that decreases your chances of getting in. So here are the pitfalls of this applicant. So there are simply too many applicants who are pre-med, and colleges want a diversity of academic interests in their incoming freshman class, not an entire class filled with doctors. So we actually at Solomon Admissions, we have the leading medical school admissions consulting practice in the country. So we work with Ivy League students who are applying to places like Harvard Medical School, Johns Hopkins Med School, et cetera. And that's fine. So it's fine to talk about a doctor, wanting to be a doctor when you're applying to med school, but when you're applying to Ivy League schools as an undergraduate, you do not want to talk about wanting to be a doctor because it'll make you look very generic. And you're not applying to medical school, so they have no interest in why you want to be a doctor. You're not applying to medical school, you're applying for a 4-year liberal arts education. And they're looking for a diversity of academic interests. And being pre-med is very cliche because a large percentage of applicants are pre-med. And once again, you don't want to look like a large percentage of applicants. So the pre-med applicant generally has a very generic extracurricular profile. So this student would have done medical research at a university for a summer. The student would have volunteered in the emergency room at a hospital. And this student would have the standard medical volunteer and clinical experiences. And so for a lot of students we work with for pre-med, if they've volunteered at the hospital, we leave that off the resume. You know, if they've shadowed a doctor, we leave that off the resume. And the reason for that is it hurts their chances of getting in. And so the key thing to keep in mind is you are not applying to medical school and no one cares why you want to be a doctor. So let's take a look at a case study of a pre-med applicant that we worked with. So this particular client was an Asian female applicant from a highly ranked and hyper-competitive public high school. She had a perfect 4.0 GPA, taking the most rigorous AP courses. She had a 2320 out of 2400 on the SAT, back when they combined the writing section with your score. She had done medical research at a university for 1 summer with no publications or awards, which is fairly unimpressive. And then she did your standard stuff. She was Science Olympiad, she volunteered at the hospital. Obviously, we left that off the resume. She was a varsity cross-country runner. She was good at drawing and also submitted an art supplement and a few smaller leadership positions. And she wanted to major in human biology at Stanford, which is the most common pre-med major at Stanford. Generally speaking, students with this profile don't get into Stanford. So the way we positioned her is that, like I said, hum bio or human biology is one of the most oversubscribed majors at Stanford and is considered pre-med central. Asian females are highly overrepresented in the pre-med arena. And like I said, when you're applying, you're compared directly against other students in your demographic. So if you're an Asian female, you're being compared against other Asian females. And if you have a very similar profile to them, you're gonna have a very hard time getting in, even with close to perfect numbers. So instead of positioning the student as a pre-med, we removed the hospital volunteering experience from our activity sheet and positioned her instead as an art history major instead. And the reason for that is, once again, art history is an undersubscribed major, and this student had perfect grades in her history courses, and she submitted a strong art supplement. And we also had her do research her senior year with an art history professor, and that boosted her application even more. And so this is an example of a pre-med student that we repositioned as art history, and the outcome was that she was accepted at Stanford, and now she's a pre-medical student at Stanford. Let's talk about case study number 2. This is the computer science and engineering applicant. So computer science is the hottest major out there right now at top universities. And what's happening these days is because of all the innovations and technologies that are coming out of Silicon Valley, what's happening is there's a bit of a brain drain from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, because it used to be a generation ago, a lot of the top students went to Wall Street to do finance. Now a lot of the top students who would have done that a generation ago are actually studying computer science, and they're going to Silicon Valley. So let's talk about some of the pitfalls of this applicant. We work with a lot of applicants who want to study computer science. We position almost none of them as computer science because, once again, oversubscribed major, and it will hurt your chances of getting in. So here are some of the pitfalls of this applicant. There are too many applicants who are interested in computer science and engineering. And once again, colleges want a diversity of academic interests in their incoming freshman class. It's not called the Stanford School of Computer Science and Engineering for a reason, because Stanford wants humanities applicants. This applicant typically has a generic extracurricular profile. So this applicant would have done robotics club, which is one of the most generic extracurricular activities you could do if you want to do engineering. This student would have done, if they're a female, they would have done Girls Who Code. This student would have taken AP Computer Science, probably gotten a 4 or 5 on the APCS exam. This student, in many cases, would have done an internship at their parents' tech company. This student would have self-taught themselves maybe 1 or 2 programming languages, and maybe they would have even created an app for their smartphone, you know? So these are very common extracurricular activities for students with this profile. And this is, keep in mind, this is especially bad positioning strategy for the most overrepresented students in the field. And who are the most overrepresented students in computer science and engineering? They're Asian American and South Asian and Indian male applicants. So if you're Asian American or Indian male, you generally, except with, unless there's a rare exception, you generally almost never want to market yourself as a computer science or engineering major. So let's look at a case study of this, of the computer science and engineering applicant. So this is a client that we work with. He was an Indian male from a top boarding school. He had all A's in the most rigorous AP courses with only 2 B's. He had a 35 out of 36 on the ACT. He did the robotics club. He had a 5 on the AP computer science exam. He self-taught himself multiple programming languages. He did tennis, chess club, speech and debate, independent project in linguistics, no research or major awards for computer science, and he wanted to major in computer science at Harvard. And this was going to be a challenge because there are thousands of Indian students with a stronger computer science profile than he has, and they're going to have a hard time getting into these schools. And so the way we strategically positioned him is that because computer science is a very oversubscribed major, and Indian males are overrepresented, are the most overrepresented in computer science, and they face the highest bar. Because of that, we positioned this student instead as a linguistics major. There's an area of linguistics. Linguistics is a highly undersubscribed major at all the top schools. There's an area of linguistics called computational linguistics, which combines computer science with linguistics, and so that would have allowed him to utilize his computer science background, but in an area that's much more advantageous. So what we did is we set this student up with a research opportunity with a computational linguistics professor, and this student applied his computer science background to study problems in linguistics instead of in pure computer science. He applied as a linguistics major at all the top schools, and he wrote his entire application about linguistics and philosophy. And the outcome was that he was accepted at Harvard and Cornell, and he's currently studying computer science. Let's talk about the business and economics applicant. So this is the applicant who wants to be an investment banker on Wall Street. We work with a lot of students who want to do banking on Wall Street. Obviously, we don't talk about that in their application. And so here are the pitfalls of this applicant. Most top colleges do not have an undergraduate business major. So if you apply to Stanford, if you apply to Duke, if you apply to Columbia, if you apply to Harvard, there's no undergraduate business major. So talking about your interest in business is not very helpful at these places because you can't actually study business. And I always tell students, listen, you're not applying to a top MBA program. You're not applying to, HBS. You're not applying to the Stanford Graduate School of Business. You're not applying to Kellogg or Northwestern. And so because of that, you don't want to talk about business in your application at most of these places because you can't study business there. And the other pitfall is that the last thing that admissions officers want to read about is an application from a 17-year-old student or 18-year-old student who wants to study economics or business, get an investment banking job on Wall Street and get rich. So once again, admissions officers don't read about they don't want to read about 18-year-old kids who want to get rich. Even though a lot of Ivy League grads go to Wall Street, that's not what they want to read about. And so we don't have our applicants write about that in the application. And keep in mind that you are not applying to an MBA program. You're applying for a 4-year liberal arts education. Very important to keep in mind because, like I said, they don't want to hear about why you want to go into business to make a lot of money. You're applying for a 4-year liberal arts education. So let's talk about a sample case study for a business and economics applicant. So this is a client that we work with. He was an Indian male from a private high school. He had all A's, taking the most rigorous AP courses. He had a 2340 out of 2400 on the SAT, back when they included the writing section. He was a nationally ranked policy debater, Eagle Scout, no business experience, and wanted to enter the dual Jerome Fisher M&T program at Penn. The M&T program is the Management and Technology program at UPenn, which combines business with engineering, and it is the most selective program to get into at UPenn. Getting into the M&T program is harder than getting into Stanford and Harvard, and it's much harder than simply getting into Wharton at UPenn. And this student eventually wanted to work at a private equity firm on Wall Street. Obviously, we didn't talk about that in the application because that would have painted him in a very negative light. And so the way we position this student is when you're applying to the M&T program at UPenn, they're really looking for 4 things. So they're looking for, number one, they're looking for students with an extremely strong quantitative background, which means very strong math grades as well as math test scores. They're also looking for students who want to take an interdisciplinary approach to academics. And the reason for that is at Penn, you have 4 different colleges. So you have nursing, you have Wharton, you have arts and sciences, you have engineering. And so they encourage you to take courses outside of your college at Penn, and because of that, they look for students who are into interdisciplinary learning. And the third thing that they're looking for is they're looking for students who have done something entrepreneurial. A lot of students have not. And by entrepreneurial, I don't necessarily mean starting a business. You can do other things such as starting a foundation or a nonprofit that shows that you are indeed entrepreneurial. And the last thing that they're looking for is the M&T program is looking for people who would be a good fit with both engineering and with Wharton. And so when this student came to us, we positioned, basically we recognized that the M&T program at Penn, like I said, looks for strong quantitative background, interdisciplinary approach to academics, and entrepreneurial spirit, not necessarily business experience, as I already stated. So what we did is we set the student up with a research opportunity with an industrial engineering and operations research professor to strengthen his quantitative background and his interdisciplinary approach. So for those of you who are not familiar with industrial engineering and operations research, it's a multi-interdisciplinary field that combines business, statistics, engineering, as well as other fields, such as it can be fields in the humanities as well. So if any of you watch the movie Moneyball with Brad Pitt, that is an example of industrial engineering and operations research. You're combining statistics with baseball, And so instead of talking about his interest in private equity and investment banking, we had him talk about his interest in wanting to combine his public policy experience through debate with his quantitative background to start a public policy think tank in Washington, D.C. So in his application, he talked about how he wanted to be a public policy quant with respect to politics and not an investment banker quant. And that also showed that he was entrepreneurial. And the outcome was that he was accepted at the M&T program at Penn, and he is currently applying for private equity and investment banking jobs. let's look at case study number 4. This is the combined BSMD applicant, and this is very similar in a lot of ways to the pre-med applicant. So the pitfalls of this applicant are that, number one, there are too many applicants who are pre-med, and colleges want a diversity of academic interests in their incoming freshman class. Like I said, you're not applying to med school. They're not looking to fill the entire class with doctors. You have to be, now one thing that's tricky about BSMD applicants is that you have to be accepted to both the undergraduate college and to the BSMD program. So for example, the PLME program at Brown, which is very popular among our students, the PLME program is a program in liberal medical education. It's the combined BSMD program at Brown. You have to be accepted to both Brown undergrad and to the medical school at Brown. And so what that means is not only does your application have to talk about why you want to be a physician, it also has to talk about why you want to go to Brown. And so Brown looks for students who want academic freedom, who want to embrace the open curriculum, and who want to take academic risks and design their own curriculum. And you have to make a compelling argument for not only why you want to be a doctor, but why you want to study the open curriculum at Brown and how that relates to your future academic interests in medical school. So you have to market yourself differently for non-BSMD programs. Like I said, at non-BSMD programs, you're not talking about why you want to be a doctor. In fact, you're leaving that stuff off your resume. Versus combined BSMD programs, which is all about talking about why you want to be a doctor, but you have to do it in a compelling way. The answer can't be simply I want to help people, because that's not a compelling answer, and you'll get laughed at during the BSMD interview if that's your answer. So let's look at a case study of a combined BSMD applicant. So this is a client that we work with. She was an Asian female from a public high school. She had a perfect 4.0 GPA, taking the most rigorous AP courses. She had a 34 on the ACT. She had national awards for research on environmental issues. She founded a club promoting interest in STEM and conservation at her high school. She was a hospital volunteer. Obviously, we left that off the resume for the non-BSMD programs. And she wanted to apply to both the top Ivies and to the PLME program at Brown, which is their combined BSMD program. So the way we positioned this student is that for the top Ivies, we removed the hospital volunteering experience from our activity sheet and marketed this student as an environmental engineering major. Since everything else being equal, female applicants are twice as likely to be admitted to engineering as an equally qualified male applicant. And so her application to the Ivies addressed her interest in conservation. And then for the PLME program at Brown, we marketed this student as somebody who wants to practice rural medicine, as there's a high demand for students who want to be doctors in rural areas. And so every med school looks for students who want to practice in rural areas. It's a good angle to go into in your application if you have the proper background for that. And so the outcome is that this student was accepted at the PLME program at Brown, as well as at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. So she had a lot of choices to choose from. So at Solomon Admissions Consulting, we provide one-on-one college counseling from former Ivy League and other top 20 school admissions officers. We help you out with everything from A to Z. That includes, obviously selecting your list of schools as well as the EDEA school. We help you out with your personal statement, including topics and outlines. And we have a separate group of editors. These editors are professional writers who've gone to lead colleges. And so they are the ones editing your personal statements for you. We help you with strategic positioning, which I've gone over multiple examples in this presentation. Supplemental essay help. We can tell you we have detailed templates on how to do the supplemental essays at each of the top schools. Our templates for each school range anywhere from 2 pages to like 7 or 8 pages, and our consultants will tell you exactly what to write about for every supplemental essay. Every school looks for something different. We can tell you what every school looks for. So if you're applying to Brown, they look for students who want academic freedom through the open curriculum. You have to stress that in your supplemental essays. If you're applying to Stanford, they look for intellectual vitality. You have to stress that in your essays. So we can tell you what every school is looking for and how to tailor your application to that school. We provide insider information on college preferences. We help you to shore up your weaknesses. So what we do is when students come to us freshman, sophomore, junior year, we assess their profile and tell them what all the weaknesses are. And more importantly, we tell them exactly what they need to do to fix them. We help you with recommendation letters. And so, recommendation letters that are stellar have to be written in a very specific way. And so obviously your recommendation letter writer, in most cases, will not know how to write a stellar recommendation letter. So we have you meet with them and advise them on what should go in the recommendation letter. We help with extracurricular activity consulting, mock interview prep, as well as financial aid. Here are sample acceptance letters of students that we've worked with. And I invite you to contact us at info@solomonadmissions.com if you want to set up a free consultation. During the free consultation, we can give you detailed feedback on your profile as well as your chances at your top choice schools, and we'll also give you feedback on what we could do to maximize your chances of getting in.